Thanks. I'm going to just jump right in. This is typically a 2-hour training session, and we're going to fit it into an hour. This will be recorded, so have that available as a resource down the road. And then we've also got a landing page that can provide additional resources and forms and some of the things that we've got. At SafePlans, our core focus is to try to help our clients get before X. What I mean by that is if you imagine emergency on a timeline, everything after X is response. Everything before X is our opportunity to prevent or at least mitigate the emergency. This predicting violent behavior threat assessment training is really the ultimate getting before X, especially for schools. There's so much that can be done, and there's some great things. And I know we've got people that are attending this webinar that have done great things, and so appreciate all that work, and would certainly welcome any feedback in the form of comments or questions during the training. And if you've got other resources or things to share, we'll make sure to get that out to everybody. Now, we can't always stay before X, so that's why at SafePlans we obviously work on a lot of emergency plans, not just for human-based threats like active shooters, but also severe weather. We're doing a lot of work now with districts and states on the epidemic influenza going around. So we can't always stay before X. Sometimes we have to respond, but we do want to spend a lot of time in the preparation phase and getting before X. When we talk about at SafePlans workplace violence or targeted school violence, we break it down into two categories: insider attacks and outsider attacks. So insider attacks, people that are associated with the organization, students, employees, things like that. Outsider attacks, they're not affiliated with the organization. They see the facility as a soft target. Physical security is typically the best defense for the outsider attacks, but for the insider attacks, which is really what we're focused on today, it is the threat assessment. The people carrying out the outsider attacks are absolutely showing warning signs. It's just that the facility that is the target isn't in a position to observe them. With insider attacks, schools are in a position to observe these. This is not a compendium of attacks. You can see we start this in 1984 with San Rosito. While not the first mass shooting, Texas Tower obviously preceded that. It just kind of shows how things have continued to change in their complexity and how attacks were carried out. We see Red Lake, Minnesota, where a student went in. This was targeted school violence and insider attack. Columbine was an insider attack. Virginia Tech, well, it's higher ed, was also an insider attack. Many of these, the Fort Hood shooting, for instance, was also an insider attack, but it's workplace, not your school setting. The Aurora Theater, where 70 people were shot inside a movie theater. We've got of course, Sandy Hook Elementary School, which was an outsider attack. Charleston's church shooting, the Pulse nightclub, Sutherland Springs, MGM recently. And of course, well, we've had, I believe, 11, depending on how you define it, mass shootings, not in school, but mass shootings. Actually, 11 school shootings in the U.S. since up to February 10th. But the one that is getting the most attention recently is Marshall County High School, where 2 people were killed and over 14 were injured. And I'm sure we'll learn more about the warning signs that existed in this. So when I talk about mass shootings, it's tough. It's tough to work around using the killer's name for me. I certainly don't want to give the killer credit or glory or anything along those lines, but I think it's important sometimes to use the killer's names and of the appropriate context and appropriate trainings. If a security guard's killed in a bank robbery, we would never ever condone that violence, but it's something people can kind of understand. In a school shooting, we all rightfully perceive this violence as senseless. And while it is senseless to us and it can never be really rationalized, to the killer, it is justified. Monsters exist, but they're not in our basements and our graveyards. They exist in our schools and our places of work. And, we've got to be able to perceive these behavioral changes that precede the attack. And we have to recognize there's a degree of shared humanity, even between us, the people that are the protectors, and the monsters that are the mass killers. So at times, I'm going to use the name of the killer. I want you to know it's not to, uh, give them credit or anything else, but it's try to illustrate that in order to recognize these monsters, we have to understand the pre-attack indicators, and we have to realize that at some point before they were a monster, they were a person, because we want to recognize them as people first to prevent them from becoming monsters. So if it offends you, I do apologize. It's not to memorialize their actions. The essence of threat assessment is this: if you cannot imagine a crime, you cannot hope to prevent it. I first got introduced in threat assessment when I was on the governor's protection detail. Obviously, governors get threats. I had the opportunity to work with the Secret Service numerous times, go through training with them, and then also with Gavin DeBecker and Associates, which is a great firm out based in California. They're worldwide. Uh, Both those have some incredible resources, and we'll make those available. When we talk about threat assessment is the process of conceptualizing various hazards in order to make judgments about their likelihood and the need for various preventative measures. So the goal of threat assessment, though, is not to determine if someone made a threat. We're trying to determine if they pose a threat. You know, a danger assessment is common in our life. This last summer, our headquarters is in the greater Tampa St. Pete area, and you see here a hurricane totally covering our state of Florida. So we have a danger assessment. It doesn't just happen. The hurricane just doesn't appear. Hurricanes occur when warm, moist air blows over the ocean, water vapor rises and forms rain, the rain's released, and the rain releases more heat into the atmosphere, which creates more warmed air rising through it, and that cycle creates the hurricane. Everything before the hurricane, everything before this was our opportunity to prepare. We did prepare. We had a danger assessment. We have an office in Missouri. Everyone shut down. We relocated, and business operations continued. It's pretty straightforward when we do that assessment. Violence is really no different. When we look at human behavior, there's the opportunity to intervene, and it is observable. It is every bit as observable as the formation of a hurricane if you're in a position to observe it and if you know what to look for. So it starts with a grievance, then it goes to ideation, then to planning, then to preparation, and then the attack occurs. When the attack occurs is when we're in the run, hide, fight, active shooter defense mode. We don't want to go into that mode. So we want to have the opportunity to intervene. So it's a process. And as long as we can see it coming, and we can if we're in a position to observe it, we've got to know what to look for. So most of this training is about what to look for, and then we'll also talk about some steps on how you can actually do an assessment. So the key thing we're looking for when we talk about to know what to look for is the person dangerous? That is really the thing. I mentioned DeBecker and Associates, Gavin DeBecker's book Gift of Fear. If you're attending this webinar, if you haven't read it, read The Gift of Fear. Obviously, you care about this topic. This book will impart more knowledge onto you about threat assessment than I ever could. It is a great resource. So highly recommend that. But in The Gift of Fear, Gavin DeBecker talks about this concept of defining dangerousness. Now, this is not a threat assessment in a formal sense, but it's a low-level assessment. In order for someone to be dangerous, the four elements of JACA have to exist, and those are justification, alternatives, consequence, and ability. So from the perspective of the subject you're assessing, not from your perspective, but from their perspective, does the subject feel justified in using violence? So here you can see a 12-year-old at Sparks Middle School, 2014. His note's a little difficult to read, but in his notebook he said, "You say mean things at school, that I'm gay, that I'm lazy, stupid, idiot. You also say that I pee my pants, and that I'm stealing my money." He felt justified in killing other people. That was in his mind, his permission to kill. Alternatives. Does the subject perceive alternatives to violence? This is a video clip from the Virginia Tech killer.
You had 100 billion chances in the ways to have avoided today, but you decided to spill my blood. You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. The decision was yours. Now you have blood on your hands that will never wash off.
In his mind, he did not see alternatives to violence. He clearly felt justified. He did not see alternatives. Now, in consequences, does the subject care about the consequences of violence? In each of these that we've talked about so far, the killer committed suicide. That is the ultimate not caring about the consequence. If there is a common factor, if you've gone through my active shooter defense training, when we talk about trying to understand the mentality of a mass killer, it's that they do not have an exit strategy. Killing people means more to them than their own life. So in consequences here at Millard High School, which is just outside of Omaha, Nebraska, killer went in, actually killed assistant principal that had just suspended him from school. And you can see his Facebook post that he posted immediately before the attack, saying that everyone that knows him, he's sorry. He says Omaha, that's the community as a whole that he was blaming. We've worked with the Omaha school system for, going on 12 years now. Uh, and the school he attends is worse. He's going to hear about all the stuff he's done. But anyway, he did not care about the consequences. He knew that he was going to carry out an attack, and he knew that it was going to be his final act. That did not stop him from carrying it out. And then lastly, the ability. Now, Kip Kinkle is the killer that you see here. Kip did not commit suicide, although it was not from a lack of desire. So Kip had had a fascination with violence really his whole young life. He was extremely obsessed with firearms. His parents bought him firearms. He got in trouble at school, and as punishment, his dad took away his firearms. And then after the firearms were taken away, he got in trouble again at school by trying to purchase a stolen weapon at school. And at that, the school thought that he would be expelled, and they would not have to worry about Kip Kinkle anymore. That night, Kip Kinkle found the guns that his dad had taken away from him, walked up behind his dad while he was reading a paper at the kitchen table, and took a Glock 9mm and shot his dad in the back of the head. He waited for his mom. His mom showed up in the garage, helped her get groceries out of the car, followed her up the stairs, shot her in the back, placed her next to his dad and realized she was still alive and shot her 3 more times. That night, he planned out his attack for Thurston High School in Springfield, Oregon. He equipped himself with 3 weapons: the Glock 9mm that he used to kill his parents, a Ruger 22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, and a Ruger 22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Those are important because he taped 2 bullets to his chest, a 9mm and a 22 caliber, so that no matter what weapon he had with him, when his last magazine went empty, he was going to be able to kill himself. During the attack, he walked into the school. He killed another student. He opened fire in the cafeteria, killed a 4th student. That includes his parents, bringing his victim count to 4. Wounded 22 others, and ultimately he was tackled and subdued. And the student that tackled him, Jacob Riker, is absolutely a hero. But all too often in active shooter trainings, they talk about this to try to encourage students to fight back, which we do not recommend at SafePlans. But this isn't about the active shooter training. The missed point is there was the opportunity to intervene. There is a difference between discipline and duty to protect. Absolutely, Kip Kinkle needed to be expelled from school for what he did. But the district had a continuing obligation to determine if he posed a threat to himself and to others. And that's where the system failed. There was no assessment, was he dangerous to other people? Because just because you expel a student doesn't mean they can come back. So the district did not, they had a separation between discipline and duty to protect. The duty to protect they felt ended when they were going to suspend or expel the student, and that system failed. So no exit strategy, but he was prevented from taking his own life when he went in. He actually had taped a knife to his leg and was able to get that out in the jail, and was trying to cut his wrist to commit suicide. So there was certainly the ability for violence here. So we looked at justification, we look at alternatives, consequence, and then lastly ability. And when that exists, the person is dangerous. So if no elements of JACA, justification, alternatives, consequence, ability, exist, the person's not dangerous. Discipline might be needed, but they're no dangerous. When we start looking at 2, 3, 4 elements of JACA, we think this person feels justified. We don't think this person sees alternatives. Whatever the case, that's when we need to do a full threat assessment. When we talk about a threat assessment to get the system started, our built-in threat assessment system is intuition. Intuition is how we determine dangerous. We're hardwired for our own survival. So I don't ever want to diminish the teachers, students, other people's intuition that are actively involved in a case. Intuition is always right for 2 reasons. It's always in response to something, and it's always acting in your best interest. So if someone has an intuitive feeling about a situation, that doesn't mean we're going to, suspend a student over intuition. We're going to get validation through the form of facts, through a formal investigation. We're not going to take action on intuition in the legal sense, but we should at least consider why we're feeling that way. We're the only creatures on earth that will override our intuition. If a deer is getting a drink at a stream and it senses danger, it runs. It doesn't put its head back down and think, I don't want to be that type of deer. So don't be that type of deer. If someone comes to you with an intuitive concern, at least consider why that's there. So we're going to get into the Safe School Initiative and go over the findings there. This was post-Columbine, where the U.S. Department of Education and the Secret Service worked together to develop accurate, useful information about prior attackers with the goal to try to help prevent future occurrences. And the finding is that school shootings are not impulsive acts. People do not just snap. Now, we're also going to talk a little bit later about how we This is a great study. There's awesome information in it. It is still highly relevant, but this was before the digital age. So we're going to try to talk a little bit about how the digital age impacts it. It doesn't impact it greatly. It's just a really the social media is a gold mine of information that can help you conduct your assessment. So things that the Safe School Initiative considered, I actually went out to DC to the National Threat Assessment Center for a couple of weeks when this was first wrapped up, and it was again a great experience, great information. You can kind of see the things that they looked at. What takes an ID to action? What are their motives? How do they select targets? How do they plan? How do they communicate? Is mental illness a factor? Other things going on in their life. So the first finding is these are not impulsive acts. They're the end result of an understandable and discernible pattern or patterns of behavior. So you can see that it's not impulsive. And the headline you see there is where a father actually turned in his daughter when he found plans of the mass shooting. She was in the planning stage. She had the ideation. She had a grievance in her mind. All these things occurred, but it was stopped before it got into the action phase because it's not impulsive act. She did not just wake up one morning and decide, I want to go out and kill people. She had been putting that through her mind, and there was the opportunity to intervene, and the father came forward, which is awesome. If we could get more parents involved to that level, we would have far fewer shootings, not just in schools, but we look at Sandy Hook, we would have had the opportunity to stop that, and we would also be able to help those people before they do turn into the monsters. Prior to most incidents, this is finding two, the attacker told someone about their idea or plan. Almost always this was another student. Not too far from where we're located in Florida, just north of us in the Ocala area, Central Florida. Students probably stopped a mass shooting. We never know if the subject was actually going to carry out the attack, but it certainly appears as though that was his goal and that student was certainly on that path. Fortunately, we'll never have to know if that student really wanted to carry out the attack because now we've had intervention and we can get that student in a case management system and keep them from becoming violent, hopefully. But those students came forward. So your school climate absolutely plays into this. And we'll touch on this again later. But having a school climate where students will come forward and share information that they might hear is critically important. The bystander study that the Secret Service did as a study up to the and the Department of Education that they did as a study up to the Safe School Initiative really looks solely at bystanders. That's still a great resource that's out there that you can download and review. Just out of time concerns, we're not going to go into great detail on that. But you can see one of the findings from the bystander study is here that some bystanders disbelieved that the attacks would occur, thus they did not report them. That makes sense, but ultimately what you have here is students doing a threat assessment. You have a student looking at a situation, a student being the bystander saying, I hear what this person's saying, I don't believe them, I'm not going to tell anybody. We don't want that to happen. We want people like you doing the threat assessments. There's many, many firms out there, local law enforcement that you can call to help you do threat assessments. What we don't want is the student to do it. So much like we don't have we don't joke about bombs in an airport, we don't want people to joke about school shootings. And if someone overhears concerns about a school-related violence, we want them to report it so we can assess the threat properly. So we don't want the bystander to do the threat assessment. Finding 3 to the Safe School Initiative, most attackers do not communicate direct threats to their targets prior to the attack. So once again, it's making a threat versus posing a threat. We care if people make threats, but our goal is to determine if they pose a threat. And then you can see the students in custody following social media postings about school shootings in California. So the social media postings weren't direct threats. He wasn't saying he was going to shoot up his school, but what he was doing was showing an extreme fascination with other school shootings, and it was certainly threatening or concerning behavior, even though it wasn't a direct threat. So we've got some information up here about threats. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but some persons who make threats ultimately pose threats. Many persons who make threats do not pose a threat, and some persons who pose threats never make them. John Hinckley never threatened Ronald Reagan before he shot him. So there are different types of threats. It's important to be familiar with those, from direct, indirect, veiled to conditional. But again, it's not if someone makes a threat, it's if they pose it. But we don't want you to ignore threats. Threats are more like promises than guarantees. If my son says, Dad, I promise I'll have the car back by 10 p.m., that's a promise, not a guarantee. It is a statement to get a desired response. Sometimes threats are the same way. People are making threats to get attention. They're trying to bring light to a topic. They don't know how else to communicate. We don't want to ignore threats, but don't wait for a threat. Finding 4, there is no accurate or useful profile. Um, so one of the first school shooters was actually a teenage girl. Many people don't realize this. 1979, and her justification, and this is not meant to be funny, was I don't like Mondays. When she was asked, when they actually called her house, she was shooting at a school across the street, and she talked to the police, and she was explaining why. So many people, and rightfully so. I mean, if we look statistically, there are more male shooters. They are typically white. There is an age range, but that is not a useful profile. So we want to look at behavior, not a profile of who might carry out an attack. We just want to look at the data as it's presented, and we're going to assess behavior in situations, not try to follow a profile. Finding 5, most shooters prior to the attack were observed engaged in some behavior that caused others concern or indicated a need for help. These are the pre-incident or pre-attack indicators, and they were there. So possible examples of concerning behavior. You can read through these: the violent behavior, the interest in extreme violence, fantasy of destruction or revenge, and then also interest in suicide. Now, obviously, if a student is exhibiting suicidal thoughts or expresses ideations, that kid needs help and we should get them help. But we also have to consider they could pose a danger to others. So Carl Menninger was an American psychiatrist that really expanded upon Freud's concept that suicide is homicide turned inward. And what he said, and it's called the Menninger triad. He said there's 3 violent wishes of man: the wish to die, which is suicidal; the wish to kill, which is homicidal; and then the wish to be killed. Victim precipitated homicide or suicide by cop. He said if 1 violent wish is present, it's bad, but the person can repress it. If 2 are present, it's worse. But if all 3 violent wishes are present and there's no intervention, a virtual certainty of violence. So suicide is one of the violent wishes. And again, obviously that kid needs help. We want to get them help. We can get them help while also trying to determine if they pose a danger to others. And that's important when we determine the case management strategy for that student that needs the help. Examples of his verbal behavior. So Barry Lukatis entered Frontier High School in Moses Lake, Washington. He murdered 3 people, including 1 teacher. An English assignment, he'd submitted a poem entitled Murder. It is my first murder. I'm at my point of no return. I can't let him live now. He'd go to the cops for sure. So I finish. I look at his body on the floor. Killing a bastard that deserves to die. Ain't nothing like it in the world, but he sure did bleed a lot. Now, Barry is also associated with this poem. Sinking into bed, homicidal feelings fill my head. Suicidal thoughts not gone but fleeing because it's other people's death I'm seeing. Suicide or homicide, homicide or suicide. Into sleep I'm sinking. Why me? I am thinking. Homicidal and suicidal thoughts intermixing. I know my life's not worth fixing. These are warning indicators. The warning signs have to be acted upon. So in these cases, all too often they're there, they're observed. Either they're not acted upon or they're not followed through. We've got to get before X. If someone is seeing the warning signs, we got to get them to report it. Then we've got to follow through to determine if the person's dangerous. But the challenge is getting people to report it. In her statement to police after the Columbine shooting, Judith Kelly, who was a creative writing teacher at Columbine, stated she contacted Dylan Klebold's, one of the murderer's parents, about an extremely violent story, and that Eric Harris frequently made machine gun or shooting type gestures at them. So just the warning signs were there. At Columbine, one of the class projects they did is a video called Hitmen for Hire, where they actually went through the school wearing their trench coats and sunglasses and executed students as hitmen. And in their script, they were executing students that they perceived were picking on or bullying other students, and they were protecting other kids. It was an extremely violent movie. We have the ability to get before X if we act on these things. The warning signs are there. We've just got to have a reporting system and people that will follow through on it. Finding 6. Most shooters had difficulty coping with significant personal loss or personal failures. So here we have, and we'll get into the bullying and next in just a little bit. That's certainly a factor. I'm not suggesting it's the factor, but the bigger thing is they don't have the same coping skills as other people tend to have. They tend to that makes it be easier for them to feel justified in violence. It's harder for them to see alternatives to violence, and they care less about the consequences of violence. So this finding 6 is very important. You can see where the Ohio school shooter allegedly killed his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend. He just was not able to cope with that loss, and combined with other factors in his life, obviously, allowed him to feel justified in carrying out a murder. And then finding 7, as I mentioned, the bullying. Many attackers felt persecuted or injured by others prior to the attack. It is certainly a factor in many school shootings. It goes back to finding 6. They don't have the same coping skills. We know bullying exists in every school in the world. We can't stop that. We should have a goal of doing that, and we should certainly try to minimize it. I'm not downplaying the importance of anti-bullying programs. We need to understand that the person that might carry out the attack, yes, they might be bullied, but everyone that's bullied does not have violent tendencies. So we need to go back to finding 6 and see if they have the coping skills and see if they start to feel what their lack of coping skills trends them towards. If it trends them towards feeling justified, not seeing alternatives, not caring about consequences, that is a concern. So is the bullying in the school, but we want to try to stop the attack too. Access to firearms, I mentioned Kip Kinkle. So finding 8, most attackers had access to and used firearms prior to the attack. Kip Kinkle is the one whose parents actually got him the guns. Here you see mothers charged in a teen's possession of guns at school. We're starting to see more of that, where the families are held accountable to try to make sure that students and juveniles do not have access to firearms. That comes into the ability of JACA, justification, alternatives, consequence, ability. Kind of difficult to protect, extremely difficult to predict if you're not working closely with your law enforcement. We'll get into that. In many cases, other students were involved in or had prior knowledge of the attack. So in Bethel, Alaska, this student was picked on a lot. It was well documented. He got in trouble at school. He wanted to do something about it, and he had 2 students assist him in preparation to the point where those 2 students got him a gun and taught him how to shoot a gun. But over 15 students knew that he was planning on an attack at least 2 weeks prior, and students showed up at a balcony over the main lobby, a mezzanine area at the school. One of them actually brought a camera the day of the shooting, but when the shooting started was too scared to actually film. But none of those students came forward. So that goes back to that bystander study in your school climate to get students to come forward. Now there's the 2 students that assisted, and those were criminal and they were charged as juveniles. But the 15 that knew weren't accomplices. They were bystanders, but none of them came forward. So the goal of the bystander study is not really focused on potential accomplices like the 2 that were juveniles and arrested, but the 15 people that knew that did not come forward. So you've got to develop that climate in your school to where someone that comes forward, that sees something, say something, and give them the resources. And then the last finding, despite prompt response, most attacks were stopped by means other than law enforcement intervention and were brief in duration. The average duration is under 3 minutes when we look at all school shootings. And that even takes into account things like the Columbine attack, which lasted the better part of 49 minutes throughout the school. We obviously, and this is why we do a lot of active shooter response training for schools, we still want to get before X. Our goal is to prevent the attack. But if we can't prevent the attack, we want to make sure schools are prepared to respond rapidly and appropriately to try to mitigate the loss of life when we fail to get before X on that. So the conclusion of the study, targeted violence is the end result of an understandable and often discernible process. So we can get before X. That's the warning signs are there. We've just got to get ourselves in a position to take advantage of the warning signs on targeted school violence. So getting started. Form a multidisciplinary district threat assessment team. Larger districts, we work with many districts that actually have school-based teams for larger schools, middle school and up typically. That is great. That would be a goal, but it can be a little daunting to think if you don't have a great program in place now how you're going to get it to every school. So start with the district level, and the district can convene to assist schools when they come up. So multidisciplinary. What we mean by that is, at a minimum, you're looking at mental health professionals, so school counselors. Many districts now have school psychiatrists, school psychologists, which is awesome. Get those involved. Someone that has school administration experience. So certainly a school principal can be on a team, or someone that understands how schools function at the administrative level. Someone that has teaching experience so that they can understand from the standpoint of classroom interactions and things like that. Your legal resources, certainly your district's, your school district attorney, and law enforcement. All those people are going to have a little bit different perspective, and that's critically important. I come from a law enforcement background, and that's my default position. I can work on threat assessment teams, but I know greatly the value of people that have mental health experience, that understand the climate of the school, that understand kids better than I do. All those things are very important. Establish a formal reporting program. Don't just say come forward if you have a problem. Spell out how you want it to do, and then the key thing there is you have to train and test the program and the processes. So if you put the formal program in place that help the students come forward, then train and test that. So train it to look for loopholes. Hopefully you're not having to do assessments unless you're a really, really large district on a regular basis. A lot of our districts that are, 10 to 20 total schools might have to do 1 to 2 of these a year. Larger districts obviously have to do more, but you have to give training and test the process. Don't just assume that it occurs. Okay, a teacher reports it. How do we make sure that doesn't slip through the cracks? Or a student reports it. So very important. We don't want to just we cross the hurdle of getting people to come forward and then we drop the ball because we don't follow through. That's just unacceptable and it's avoidable. When you're conducting an assessment, now what you see here is something we use in a lot of our trainings. It was developed by an Air Force fighter pilot named John Boyd. It's called the Boyd Cycle, or the acronym is OODA for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. So it's also called the OODA loop, which is what I typically refer to it as. It's not that you have to follow this system. But when we're making an assessment, the first thing we have to do is we have to observe that there's a problem. So whether that's an anonymous report, whether that is a something that a teacher saw, whether it's a assignment that was turned in, a parent calls, whatever it is, we have to observe there's a problem. Then we orient ourselves to the problem, we decide on our best course of action, and then we act. But the thing about the OODA loop is if the situation changes, the loop repeats. So if new information is presented, and that information might totally exonerate the subject, it makes us understand that they're not violent and feel good about it. That's wonderful. Conversely, the situation can change to where, wow, that puts a whole different light on it. We didn't know that he had gone out and bought a gun, or we didn't know that he had written a suicide note. All those things can change it. So the loop gets us in the mindset that as an investigator, the situation's going to change. So how do we observe? Anonymous reports, we'll talk a little bit about that. Students can come forward, which is awesome. They're willing to say who they are and make a report, which can help us validate and gauge just how good the information is. Teachers, incredible resource. They see the students. Parents can come forward, not just parents like what we saw in the one where the parent came forward to turn in his daughter who was talking about it. Parents of other students that could be potential victims or peers of the student that's of a concern. At Columbine, a student that was a parent of one of the students that was a victim had come forward to express concerns that they had been communicated. So parents can come forward, not just parents of the subject. Law enforcement can come to you with things they learn outside of the school. Um, and then healthcare providers, and we'll talk about the challenges with that because there are privacy issues with healthcare. A lot of times they can be worked around. So anonymous reports, we've actually built out a new system in our ERIP that we provide to a couple of states and districts all over the country. But what we want, we've set it up to where we can do anonymous reports. Now, anonymous is meaning we do not require the reporter to provide a name. Does not mean that it is not possible to go back and trace IP addresses. There's a lot of systems out there that purport their anonymity, that there's no way to track it. I don't know that that's really needed. Texas, for instance, has a new law that requires anonymous reporting, and it basically just says allow the person to report it. If someone were to use one of these systems, and I certainly would highly discourage it, to make a threat against the President of the United States, I think you would find it's not anonymous. In that sense, we don't mean that. We mean the person does not have to provide their name to get the process started. And that's what we promise in our system. And we also want to provide resources. But the things you should look for when you're setting up a system, one, the option for the reporter to identify. We want the person to identify. It helps us quantify and qualify the information. To be able to have different categories. They don't just say a different concern. That way you can send the concerns to the right person. Redundant communications. How do people get alerted about the report? With what we looked at is we want text, we want email, we want the mobile app to push information, and we want them to get a call to say, hey, you just received a report of a threat of violence towards your school. You need to log on to the system right away and look at it. We don't want that to slip. Communications to teams, meaning you can have multidisciplinary people that all get the same alert. We want the alerts to repeat until it gets confirmed. Meaning if someone from the team doesn't go onto the system and say, okay, I'm looking into this, and that alerts everyone else that someone's looking into it, it's going to keep pinging you guys until someone looks at it at whatever time interval you want. Now, if it's a threat of violence to the school, we recommend a very, very short time interval. If it's bullying, again, not suggesting that's not important, but an 8-hour interval might be acceptable on that. And you can set those up on however you want. You can add team members to invite them in, and then a full case management dashboard so you can actually attach files and be compliant with all the privacy issues. But so anonymous reports are key. it's not that we're trying to say that we're promising a guarantee that this person has, the same level of, the same level of protection as, say, attorney-client privilege. There's no possible way to know. We're not trying to engage in that level of interaction. We just don't require them to give a name. So next we want to orient. So we've observed, however we got the report. Now we got to orient. We got to collect information to orient. We got to collect as much information as we can so we can orient ourselves as good as possible. So key things here: the facts that drew the attention. That's very key. And then we also want to look at information about the subject. So facts that drew the attention for the subject. Why was this report made? And then the situation that exists. So if it was a threat about a breakup or bullying or whatever it was, we want to try to get facts about that. And then if we know there's possible targets, we want to look at that. And then we want to get information about the subject. The first thing we're trying to do here is answer JACA, justification, alternatives, consequence, ability. And you're going to have to apply a little bit of tradecraft. There's ways to conduct these assessments. So sources of information. We say covert-ish. Covert meaning the student that, or the subject of the investigation is not likely to know you're doing this. So the reporting party, depending on how that was made, talking to that person, it gives you a degree. Student records, your teachers, your counselors, law enforcement, healthcare providers, social media to agree. We'll touch on that. Gives you a degree of the person might not know exactly what you're doing. Overt doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, but when you do overt measures, the subject of the investigation is going to know they're being investigated. So when you start talking to parents or caregivers, figure the person knows. Obviously, when you talk to the subject itself. When you start talking to other students, word's going to get out quickly. When you start talking to potential victims, word typically gets out quickly because people have the shock factor. Even if it's a teacher, doesn't mean you don't warn them, doesn't mean you don't tell them, but realize it's human nature. They're going to share that information. It is a very unique situation that someone is threatening your life. You feel scared, you feel violated. It's human nature to talk about that. So just realize one is not necessarily better than the other. Both are needed, but once you start the overt measures, realize the subject's probably going to know, and you should have that as part of your game plan. Social media. It is a gold mine of information. So one of the things that has changed since the Safe School Initiative is social media, its prevalence. We're not going to go over every possible social media platform. What I want to try to impart here is that it's manageable. You can do it. Even if you're not a social media expert, you can have someone on your team that is, and it's a very efficient and effective way to gain more information. So with Facebook, some key things. Are Facebook names actual? They're supposed to be. Facebook prohibits fictitious accounts, doesn't mean they don't exist. If the person is using a fictitious name and posting things about your school or part of the investigation, then you can determine the IP address and the service provider, or probably determine who it was, but that's probably going to require a court order, a subpoena, search warrant. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Can people tell if you've looked at their Facebook profile? No, they cannot. So if they have a public-facing profile and they have public information on their Facebook page and you're looking at it, they don't know that you looked at it. Can you see everything someone posts? No. They can make things private. So we don't want to pretend like if you see something on Facebook, you know everything that's going on in that person's life. In some cases, you will. In most cases, no, but it's still good information. So if everything's private, so be it. The only way to get through that is with a warrant. And this explains it. So Instagram is also owned by Facebook, which is another very popular firm. We have the link up there. If you just Google Facebook legal process, it comes right up. They've got a page devoted to this, so you don't have to take notes on this or anything else. They will disclose account records in accordance with their terms of service, which means they won't, but applicable law. So a valid subpoena in connection with an official criminal investigation. That's why law enforcement needs to be part of your threat assessment team. It doesn't mean that every investigation is going to go to a warrant phase, but if it is, this could be a valid criminal investigation if it reaches a certain threshold and law enforcement can get this information. A court order, a search warrant, all those things are listed on there. So if you're trying to figure some things out and need more information, this would be the process that you could look at. This also deals with cyberbullying, when we have some people that, we've worked with districts on this where cyberbullying's occurred, not necessarily a threat of violence, but cyberbullying or cyberstalking, and they're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. This can also be an incredibly valuable process. Twitter, our Twitter handles actual names, not usually. Twitter doesn't require any type of validation of the account. So sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't. What you have to the right is a tweet wheel. There's resources out there, but what you can do is kind of connect the dots where you know who certain Twitter people are by their names. You can see who they follow, who they connect with, who posts with them, and a lot of times you can, by process of elimination, figure out who students are, even though they're not using their actual names. It just takes a little bit of time. It's not terribly difficult. Can people tell that if you've looked at their tweets or Twitter page? No, they cannot. Can you see everything someone posts on Twitter or tweets? No, you cannot. They can set it to private, and then it goes back to the same as Facebook. You're going to have to get a court order, but Twitter, which also owns Periscope, is also very on top of this. They get a preservation request from law enforcement. They will hold it for at least 90 days. That does not mean they're going to give it to law enforcement, but they'll make sure that information isn't deleted, and they'll make sure that it's there with a screenshot. And then if you need information, they follow the legal process. So it's there. So any social media you're worried about, kind of follow these guidelines. It's just getting in there and realizing it's a resource and not being intimidated that you shouldn't look at it because it is a gold mine of information and you should uh, not use it. So privacy rights. So FERPA, Federal Education Rights Privacy Act. So FERPA is not an impediment to a threat assessment. Too many school district attorneys do not understand this. It's very clear in the code, which you see at the bottom, Title 34 of CFR, Section 99.32. It's very clear that FERPA actually encourages information to be shared when public safety is a concern. It literally encourages it. So the other thing about FERPA is it governs only records. So FERPA does not protect observations, your discussions, or communications, just the student's records. So you don't need to share the student's records in many cases. We're not, so anyway, that's in there. And then it does not have any jurisdiction over law enforcement records. So the law enforcement side of things does not, now there are obviously juvenile protection record laws, but FERPA does not touch that. Health information. So this one is a little trickier. If you're dealing with a healthcare provider or need to be dealing with a healthcare provider, mental health is certainly a concern in these situations. Confidentiality is held by the client, not the mental health provider. So if the subject is a juvenile, it's held by their parents. If they're an adult, it's held by the subject. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. When privacy laws are an impediment, you can consider asking the subject for permission to disclose, meaning they can tell the mental health care provider, yes, share this information with the school system. There's no legal prohibition, so there's no prohibition against you providing information to the healthcare professionals, meaning FERPA does not stop you when there's a public safety concern from telling a student's mental health provider, this is why we're worried about this student in regards to the safety of this student and other people. Then you can inquire about Tarasoff versus Regents of California. Tarasoff is a court ruling that's well documented, well established case law that says psychotherapists have a duty to protect an individual if they reasonably believe that person to be at risk of injury based on the patient's confidential statements. So if you show them through your research that you think there's a danger and they have one, Tarasoff says they have an obligation. So just some things, and obviously that's why you want a lawyer on your team because they're going to be a lot more up on this than I ever will be. So when we're trying to determine dangerous, so we've oriented, we've observed the concern, we're trying to orient, now we're trying to get everything in place to see if there's dangerous. So we're all capable of violence, meaning we'll talk to people and do trainings and people say, well, I could never be violent unless someone's threatened my kids. Then we can understand that. So they have a different, that's a rational level of justification. But everyone's capable of great violence, but no one person is dangerous to all people at all times. So we need to come from that standpoint that some people might be part of this assessment. They might see information, you might talk to people, and they'll say, you know what, I don't think they're dangerous. And from their perspective, they're not wrong. We're trying to get as much information as we can when we orient so we can get a full picture. So we're evaluating the information gathered from research, from interviews, and then we've got 11 questions that I'm going to go over that can kind of help you frame whether or not good questions to ask and consider. And again, this is recorded, so you'll have all this, and we actually have these 11 questions as a printout. So you've got that. So the first thing, what do you think the student's motives are? That's going to help paint the picture. If we can't find motives, we're not seeing justification, which could indicate the person's not dangerous. Have there been any communication suggesting ideas or an intent to attack? Again, use social media. If you're doing a threat assessment, someone needs to at least try to see what the student's doing on social media or the subject's doing on social media. 3. Has the subject shown inappropriate interest in any of the following? School attacks or attackers, weapons, incidents of mass violence, These are warning signs. So if it's an inappropriate interest, that's what we want to know. Has the student engaged in attack-related behaviors? So this can include developing an idea or attack plan. So making efforts to acquire or practice with weapons, surveillance, casing, checking out possible sites for the attack, rehearsing and attacks or ambushes. So they're big indicators. You can also look at your resources within the school to try to determine that. Does a student have the capacity to carry out an act of targeted violence? So this is a little bit of a mental health thing, not um, from the standpoint of how organized is the student's thinking and behavior. So if the student can logically follow a plan and develop a strategy, then they have the mental capacity. So, but that's where mental health professionals can get in. Is the student experiencing hopelessness, desperation, and or despair? So we want to try to view that from the student standpoint, an honest assessment of how that person feels. Not do we think they should feel hopelessness, not do we think they should just get over the fact their girlfriend broke up with them or get over the fact he got picked on. How do they feel? It's important to have that perspective. Does the student have a trusting relationship with at least one responsible adult? That's critical. And if you haven't already talked to that adult when it comes time to case management, that's going to be a big factor in that case management. But try to understand if they've got a responsible relationship. Sometimes that's not the parents, and those in education know that all too well, that the parent is not really considered a responsible adult. Does the student see violence as an acceptable, desirable, or only way to solve problems? That's that JACA, justification first hurdle. They feel justified in violence. Is the student's conversation or story consistent with his or her actions? So see what the student's saying, everything's fine, there's no problems, but you're doing the investigation and you see that they are picked on in school, or they do have a horrible life at home, or other things have happened in their life that's not fine, and they don't have the coping skills, and they're just telling you what you want to hear to end it. So that's part of the investigation process. Are other people concerned about the student's potential for violence? This is that intuition that I talked about in the beginning. Intuition's always in response to something, and it's always acting in our best interest. So don't discount intuition. What circumstances might affect the likelihood of an attack? And this is good or bad. Wow, when I look at this person's life, this is the linchpin, and they've got a dog and they look forward to going home and seeing it and whatever. And then conversely, if that dog were to die, now what would happen? So that's a very short example, but consider what could change in that person's life that would increase or decrease the likelihood of the attack. Those things that would decrease the likelihood of the attack are the things we want to build on in a case management. So those are the 11 questions. Speaking of questions, there will be time at the end as we wrap up. So if you have questions, be happy to answer those. We'll also get a list out to everyone. So just put those in the chat feature. When we're trying to decide, so we observed, we orient, now we got to decide. Ask the following questions. Does the information collected prompt more a concern or less of a concern about the possibility the student is moving towards the path toward a school attack or violence? What information might prompt a lesser concern? What information might heighten the concern? What options exist for intervening or redirecting the student away from the dangerous behavior? That's case management. And then, should potential targets or potential victims be contacted or warned away or protected? Obviously, then you're overt. You're no longer in the covert-ish world. That's okay. It still might need to happen, and you have an obligation to do that. So be aware of that as you're going through these. Those are questions you should be considering constantly during the investigation process. The OODA loop, remember, it repeats. All threats aren't equal. How you label threats can be unique. We've got a system here where it's okay to say there's no threat. We got a report, it was a misunderstanding or a rational explanation, and we are confident saying there was no threat, there was no danger, we're done with this. Transient or low level could be a student that was on a playground and said, I'm going to kill you, but when you interview him, he's like, I was just joking, I didn't mean it, I'm so sorry, I would never hurt him, and you believe him. Well, he made a threat. We can't say he didn't, but there's no need for further action. It's done. Substantive or a medium level, indication of continuing intent to harm someone. Obviously, we've got some concerns here, and we're not going to let this one just go away. We're going to develop a strategy. And then the serious involves a threat to kill, rape, or use of a weapon to severely injure someone or many people. So all threats aren't equal, and it's okay that your system embraces that. So when we look to act on the high level or very serious threats, the key things you want to do: control the situation and or the student in a way that prevent the possibility of an attack. That can include law enforcement. It can include lots of different options. we'll talk to those in case management to include like psychiatric involuntary committal, depending on the situation. But if it's serious, we can't just say, hey, we'll talk to you later about this. We've got to get that thing under control. Kip Kinkle was showing a high level of threat when he was expelled, but he was allowed to go home. We need to get systems in place to mitigate that. Protecting and aiding possible targets of the attack. So things you need to think about. If we know there's a kill list or people that might be of a concern, you've got to let them know and provide them resources. That's where law enforcement can help. Then we want to provide support and guidance to help the student or the subject resolve the issues giving rise to the attack motive. That's case management. We want to help them realize they're not justified. We want them to see alternatives, and we want them to care about the consequence, because it's really hard for us, unless they're in the school setting permanently or a jail, to control their ability to get weapons. So case management is where we get into the act area. So on one extreme we have no danger, and on the other extreme we have danger. Both those are pretty easy to deal with. They're pretty clear cut. They're black and white. The reality of case management is it's a lot of shades of gray. And that's where it gets to be a challenge. If someone's no danger, great. If they're high danger, we can develop systems for that. That's not good, but it's easier to manage. But what about the student that we think is dangerous, but they are not going to be involved in the criminal justice system? They're not going to be expelled. They're going to be part of our school community, and we need to get them on a path away from violence. That's case management. Remember, as the case changes, repeat the loop. So case management options, and again, if you have questions, please feel free to submit those in. So when we look at case management options, psychiatric evaluation. Law enforcement, most states have an exception to where someone can be committed against their will for up to 72 hours. If there's the need, and law enforcement will sign off on it, and then it turns it over to medical professionals in that institution. But that's an option. It's extreme. It would depend on the situation. Obviously, getting law enforcement involved in that and with other areas for case management, especially if you believe that the attack, the assessment rose to the level of criminality. So that's why we have law enforcement involved in this process. Family, parental and family involvement, again, that can be a great resource. Mental health care, so those are things with outpatient, pastoral counseling. If the family's involved in a church or interested in being involved with a faith-based organization, not just a church, any faith-based organization can help. A mentoring relationship, a responsible adult that can have a positive impact on this young person to help get them towards the right path. You can make academic or work accommodations so that maybe they are bullied. Maybe their perception of bullying is different than the real world. Regardless, their perception is their reality, and how can we separate them from other students in a way that's going to allow them to continue to proceed on a positive path, but minimize their engagement? And obviously, school climate things on a larger scale is very important on the bullying to develop a better school climate, but individual accommodations, separation from the institution. We're not doing that in a way that we're forgetting about them. We're maintaining involved. We're staying engaged as an institution, but maybe we send them to another school, maybe another district, but we develop case management strategies to help make sure that we don't just allow them to get back on a path towards violence. Training in social skills, how to better cope. That finding six, where they don't have the coping skills that other people have. That's where we want to develop those. A behavioral contract to help them, feel a commitment. Diversion programs, all those things are options. So things to consider. I'm going to leave with this. When I talk about these threat assessment things, I've got some pretty simple questions we ask schools and districts. So one, if you thought someone posed a danger to others, would you tell someone? Most in the educational world will say yes. Well, everyone in your school should say yes to that. But then when it gets a little trickier, if I ask a teacher the first question and they say yes, I say, who will you tell? In some districts, that's not clear cut. And then how would you tell is also not clear cut. Your students, your teachers, your parents should be able to answer yes with specifics to each one of these. If you thought someone posed a danger, would you tell? Yes. Who would you tell? This is who I would tell, and this is how I would tell them. So whether it's anonymous, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, we want to lower these barriers of reporting. So, consider how this impacts your school. Do you feel comfortable that students would come forward? Who would they tell? And that can be more than one answer. How would they tell? That can include anonymous. Your staff. Would they come forward? I certainly hope so. Make sure they understand that it's an obligation of their employment to come forward. Tell them who they should tell and tell them how they should report it. Eliminating these barriers gets to the observe. The process of a threat assessment, observe, orient, decide, act, does not start without the observation. So we want to make sure those are lowered. So with that, big believer that in an emergency, you don't rise to the occasion, you drop to your lowest level of training. So hope this time was useful to you. We've got several other recorded webinars. I think our next webinar is probably going to be physical security for schools. But if you have any questions, certainly go ahead and post those and I'll be answering them. Or just reach out to me directly. Would love to help if I can. So thank you very much for your time and we'll be answering some questions.